The Powerhouse acknowledges the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians and the first astronomers of the land the Sydney Observatory is situated on. We pay our respects and seek guidance from their continuous connection to this place and to the sky country above us. On Time is a Powerhouse series recorded live at Sydney Observatory. We explore our experience of time over 4 conversations, weaving science, philosophy, and story. We're asking not just what time is, but how it governs our sense of self, and what shifts when we understand it differently. I'm Rachael Hocking, a Warlpiri woman, journalist and educator. I'll be guiding us through these conversations where you will meet the thinkers and storytellers I had the privilege of yarning with over the cycles and seasons of 2025. Time is a vast, interconnected story, etched into landscapes, encoded in songlines, and carried through oral traditions. In this conversation on Deep Time, I yarn with my friend, storyteller Bronte Gosper. Together we weave and untangle the many threads which tie us to country, community, time and place. The lines between past, present and future blur as we remember lessons from our ancestors who have walked this earth for millennia. Bronte Gosper is a Wiradjuri woman, documentary maker, writer and storyteller from Orange in regional New South Wales. She holds a Master of Arts from the Oral History program at Columbia University, where her work explored how Indigenous storytellers challenge linear ideas of time by holding past, present and future in relationship. Her documentary Collapsing Time examines Indigenous temporalities through place, story and everyday life, revealing how deep time is lived, felt and carried across generations. Thank you so much for joining me, Bronte.
Thanks for having me, Rich.
I want to ask you to bring people into the work that you've been doing for the last couple of years.
I think most of what I've been interested in my academic work has been how we structure and relate to time and how that kind of shapes everything we do, like it shapes how we tell stories and how we govern countries and how we create policies and how we treat each other. My thesis while I was at Columbia explored how Indigenous storytellers challenged settler colonial concepts of time. And they did that by holding past, present and future in a relational sense rather than in a linear sense. And I think that's a really important way to look at time, especially in a country like Australia where we're so obsessed with moving forward and progress, and yet it seems to be something that kind of plagues us as a nation as well.
As we know, blackfellas, Indigenous people, Aboriginal people around the world, it's pretty common to feel situated in the past, to feel that our culture is either timeless, beyond time, past time. How do you see that manifest?
Yeah, I think Australia has always kind of been plagued by this perception that Indigenous people prior to British colonisation were kind of just wandering around aimlessly with no organised society and no sense of time or history or moments of importance, which of course is not true, but that's something that's definitely persisted. You'll hear conservative commentators talking about the idea that, you know, Indigenous people need to move into the future and be grateful. That was a very conscious thing, creating this idea that Christianity was the start of history and that there was no history before the Bible was brought to Australia. And you're seeing that happening now in other parts of the world, like in the Amazon. There's like evangelical groups that are working alongside mining groups to basically strip culture away from the Indigenous people that are there and replace it with Christianity, and in doing so rid those people of their understanding of their culture and their religion, which is of course very tied to the land. And then conveniently they lose that and they believe in this other religion which separates them from land entirely and puts this temporal change, this linear notion of history where the future is heaven and not anything that you have to have a responsibility to right now. And I think it happens as well in Australia in a different way, where our issues are seen to be historical and the past wrongs are what needs to be addressed rather than the current systemic structural issues that are affecting Indigenous people and affecting the rest of the nation as well. It's something that we can move on from. And you even saw that with like the Bringing Them Home report. Like it was meant to be this kind of moment of the stolen generations testimonies being given, and then there was this like national healing that happened, but no monetary compensation was given, of course, and no structural change occurred. But there was a whole lot of like symbolic bullshit.
You have said to me, and this is a quote, "Every single issue we're facing can be attributed to a lack of awareness of time." You talked a bit about how this plays out in Australian government policies, especially policies of removal of children. But how do you see this chopping up of time affecting our ability to thrive, particularly when we talk about not just reducing us to historical matters, but situating the past in this place, which you talked about as being unattainable, somewhere that is not us, not with us, not of us?
Yeah. This lack of awareness of time that I'm talking about, I suppose, is the idea that there's like a short-termism in Australia that kind of you see most predominantly in Indigenous affairs, Indigenous issues. Every new minister that comes in, it's like you're waking up again, and there's this onus on Indigenous communities and Indigenous groups to reprove need and to re-establish things that have long been established. And then there's a new symbolic, like now it's reconciliation or now it's truth-telling. And it's like this kind of amnesia that results, I think, from this, lack of being aware of the passage of time. And I guess when I talk about like Indigenous temporalities and how they try to be really attuned to both the future and this like Iroquois idea, like accounting for 7 generations after you, but also accounting for
7 generations before you.
Exactly. So like what's happened in the past and how that informs the present, and living in a present that's enfolded with the future and the past, rather than this kind of like blind dissociative state. Positioning these things as Indigenous issues rather than systemic issues is kind of where we fall into a lot of problems. It's these issues that come from a general lack of awareness of those things, of history and the future. This idea that we're kind of in this state-sanctioned amnesia and this like cyclical thing, which is funny because they refer to Indigenous temporality as cyclical, which is kind of romanticised.
It feels like we have been placed in a very convenient position for Australia to make decisions about us, because the minute our experiences, our philosophies, our histories and our ancestors, our sciences are in the past, in the dream time, dreamt of,
imagined,
then they're not tangible enough to be relevant right now, and they're not connected to right now. So I guess, what is the alternative? Because you talk and you've written very beautifully about the everyone. Do you mind talking about it and how it offers an alternative way for humans to conceptualise their relationship with time?
The everyone was initially an idea from a white anthropologist trying to understand Indigenous concepts of time, Stanner. He was basically trying to conceptualise this enfoldedness of past, present and future across like a million different Indigenous groups that all had very different ways of thinking about it. But he did it pretty good. It's a great word. I mean, I don't know how to fix these problems, but if I had to suggest something, probably is just like refusing to accept or be numb to this system that understands value in this like really symbolic, short-term, metaphorical fugue state, and instead trying to be conscious of these things that are going on, where if you're seeing the same things happening, the same patterns happening in Indigenous affairs, being aware of the fact that it is quite a broken system and trying to be more aware of this enfoldedness. And I don't think that's like just a specifically Indigenous idea either. Like Plato had these ideas, and other Greek philosophers like Heraclitus had this idea of like you never step into the same river twice. They had similar ideas that then kind of got twisted into things that then came to be what we have as like modern structures of society. But like these original ideas that I think are quite human, and you see it in every aspect, I suppose, of Australian politics and across the world. It's this lack of awareness to time. There's this phenomenon that after people watched the movie Avatar, they got like a diagnosable genre of depression because they were like, wow, we will never have this like Indigenous world system again, which I just think speaks to the fact that, yeah, it is a human desire to be connected to nature. And like Orange, there's farmers, and it's a rural place where people feel this deep connection to the land and country and
responsibility, right?
Yeah, responsibility to the future and to the present that you lose if you're in a system that's in a fugue state all the time of what's happening right now.
Being able to relate to a movie about colonisation where the people are blue and from another planet, I think says something else about the audience
it's
reaction
more palatable,
as well.
right? Yeah. Exactly, the poor blue people.
We should also talk about the fact that you've written a pretty incredible thesis and you've made a documentary called Collapsing Time, Indigenous Storytellers and the Everywhen. So in the documentary, what Bronte has done really beautifully is she takes you on a journey. You're basically taking us north of Broome, right? Bardi country, Western Australia, and a woman called Rahana and her family have invited Bronte into their space to go fishing, to eat food, to go hunting, and just to be on country. When you watch scenes from the documentary, they are slow. You are going through time with them, and you're experiencing conversations that you would have with your brother and sister, with your mother and father in real time. The editing is very sparse, although I am sure that there was a very involved editing process. Can you talk to me about this documentary and in particular how you have sought to collapse time in your filmmaking process?
Yeah, it was a really special documentary. Originally, my thesis was going to be, it was super cliched and boring sounding, but I was going to just interview like Indigenous change makers around Australia. And Rahana was someone that I'd met a few years before, and she kind of had this story about how she was a community activist and she'd done a lot of work for her community. So I started doing that process, and I interviewed her, and I interviewed a Wiradjuri man who lives in Lismore. And very quickly it became a very different thesis, and we just started all talking about how we experience time. When I was up on Adialoon with Rahana and her family, the parts of the story that she wanted me to capture was like catching the fish and like getting the oysters and all these like really key elements of Bardi life that are all oriented around the tides and the time of the day. And it just ended up being much less like a linear story of like, when I was 16, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and more just kind of feeling and like being inside of this time as her family was experiencing it. And that's kind of what I wanted it to feel like when people were watching it. Snippets of stories here and there, which is kind of what it's like when you're like going and traveling with someone. You hear like little parts of stories. they're not in order and it doesn't make any sense really, but it lives in a place and orients you to some understanding of that place. And yeah, her other family members became like just as important in the story as well. Like it wasn't really about her by the end of it. It was much more about her son, who was wanting to be like a rapper, and he makes music, and he was talking a lot about time. And he actually had this court case when we were there. He like suffers from seizures, and he had a really bad seizure one night, and the cops were called by the neighbour. 10 cops showed up, basically like pinned him down, and he like resisted, and then he got charged with like assaulting a police officer. He was talking to me a lot about it and being like, they don't care about time. Because he's like a very respected lawman where he's from. Like he is like one of the up and coming youth that's going to be like passing on really important stories that tell you how to care for the land, tell you how to be in a place, and tell you what's safe and what's not, and you know, how to live as a human being. And I guess I came to kind of talk to him more about that and understand that he was talking not from this like Western possessive sense of like, they don't respect my time, but he was more like, they just like aren't aware of like the history, and they're not aware of the future, and they're not aware of where I need to be right now and the responsibilities I have right now, because he couldn't be back in Ardealung because we were in Broome in the courthouse.
That shifted your approach to what it was that you were capturing or witnessing. And you've talked about some of those learnings before, but do you mind sharing where you had moments of, oh, okay, this is what I'm doing?
I guess, yeah, we started with just a lot of filming. Rahana has a very creative mind because she's like an actress. So she was like, maybe we'll do this, maybe we'll do this. And like we were both kind of creating it together. It allowed the stories to unfold in a way that was more natural. Her other son, Hamey, was filming kind of the whole second half, which was interesting because what he wanted to focus on became the focus of the film. Like another one of her sons who was fishing, and like his fishing prowess, you know, it became like a very different thing. He was just very curious about it, and I also wanted it to be his vision as well because he knew her in such a different way to me. And we ended up with like really funny shots, and he did this whole sequence that was like a horror movie, like, and it kind of became like a different form as well, like half documentary, and then it went into like fictional with him kind of doing his like horror stuff. And then he was kind of like singing for a while, and then it was like a musical. Yeah, it kind of became a very different thing. But I think that got more of the core of like who Rahana is and who her family is and how they move through the world.
I mean, I think I've like experienced what you've talked about just through hearing a lot of my family talk about their experiences with television and film. It's very hard, I think, for anyone listening to this to imagine how we would conceive of using a camera or pointing a camera before we knew what a camera was or what it was meant for. In 1985, Australia got a satellite, the AusSat satellite, and it broadcast television to remote parts of Australia for the first time. And one of the places that it broadcast television to was a community that my ancestors are from, Yuendamu. In the lead up to that satellite being launched, there was a lot of conversation happening because it was happening around the world in other colonised nations such as Canada. What is mainstream television access, or what is television access? What is pop culture going to mean for Indigenous peoples who live in remote or rural populations? What's it going to mean for the people who've never seen that before? And my ancestors were part of those populations who were being considered. And so American anthropologists came to Yuendamu and they brought some antennas with them. And they thought, well, why don't you experiment with pirate television before the satellite is introduced? And what that allowed is it allowed for the community to have a TV station and have satellites on the homes that could broadcast productions which were made in community and were only broadcast to the people from that community. I find it really hard to imagine that because of how accessible everything is today. What's really interesting is looking at the oral histories of that time and hearing people like my uncle Francis Kelly and listening to a lot of the old women at the time as well, and how they used the video cameras that had been brought in by all these anthropologists. They would grab the video cameras and they would just take them out, and then they would rush back and they would upload the footage. Sometimes they would take those video cameras and they would record what they call secret ceremonies. It might be women's business, it might be men's business, it might be a sorry ceremony. And they would take them back and they would say, these are not to be broadcast to the community, these are to be stored in a different room, which will only be viewed by people who are from the right skin group or who have the right family connection to sit down and actually absorb that information. But even the footage that was broadcast on television to the community, just the community, it's very different to what we see on TV today, you know. It's not like this fast, quick sound bites. And hearing like anthropologists at the time talk about, I don't know why they were zooming in on this plant, but everyone else around me was like, I know why they're zooming in on that plant or that part of country, because there was a story there that they were focusing in on. And so I guess the question for you, after my long-winded tour through my family's history, is how have you seen your experiences with Rahana and your own family influence the way that you are going to, or that you do currently, approach your filmmaking and your artistry?
I guess it probably comes from partly doing this work with Rahana, but I think I've always been interested in observational documentaries, which probably comes from, growing up in Orange and just everything being quite slow, and me and my brother making documentaries together as kids, where we were really just absorbing the world around us in this like really childlike way, which I think probably has bled into what I want to make now, and probably why I wanted her son to make so much of it, actually, now that I think about it. Like, it's just such a different and attentive way to be in the world, and what we're talking about with this attentiveness to time from a child's perspective before you've kind of been adopted into the world that we live in now, when you still have this kind of, what's worth my attention and what can I focus on? And it's a slower thing, I think, when you're younger. And when you're older. My grandpa used to just sit out and watch nothingness for like hours and hours. And I used to be like, what's he looking at? And it's funny that at the beginning and end of life, you give more things your attention.
Honing that awareness of time.
Yeah, which is now only engaged with very partially by Western culture as like, take a little time to meditate so that you can then keep grinding away, like rather than as a way that informs how you live.
Do you feel comfortable sharing when you have felt particularly aware of time?
I mean, when people die, like time kind of slows down.
Grief stops the clock. It's true.
It's like an intrusion. It's the one thing that in Western society, people are like, okay, someone's died, we can all slow down. But the goal, I guess, would be to move towards a more general state of attentiveness. And like in a practical sense, being aware of the world around you and watching like, oh, that tree looks different to how it looked 4 years ago. That probably means we're like ruining the world. That attentiveness is what would probably help a lot of the ecological damage that's happening. And that's why these like Aboriginal protest slogans of like still here and always was interrupt this so much, because it's a rejection of that sense of time.
It is basically a way of saying, I am interested in a reality where we are not just existing for this moment.
Yeah.
I care deeply about what happens next, and I care about what happened before, and I don't see them as disconnected. You've talked about an experience where you've felt that, but why are you so drawn to these concepts, which are, for a lot of people, easily put into metaphor, easily placed out of mind? Why do you care about talking about time as something that is tangible and something to be reckoned with?
I think I have an interest in understanding why things aren't working. I watch this world that we are living in affect people I care about, and I think it's me trying to grapple with how do we go forward? Like, how do we address this kind of crisis, I suppose? Both parties in Australia seem to be speaking in metaphors, especially in Indigenous affairs. And I just get exhausted, I think, by seeing these like constant, meaningless conversations about reconciliation and what's the next like metaphor that we're going to use, as if the job of Indigenous activists is just to reinvent the metaphors that we use to talk about racial injustice. I suppose thinking about time and paying attention to the cyclical nature of these conversations and how repetitive it is and how ridiculous it is that we're still talking about this and not making structural change. It's me trying to force attention onto this kind of like dissociative state of, oh, isn't it so good that we got a place name on a map? It doesn't feel enough. It feels like we need to be just doing very practical things. And I mean, when I say we, I mean the government, but
funding cycles that go beyond 12
3
months, beyond 3
years. And then, like living in accordance with time and with the world and the planet. That's where Indigenous temporality can inform that way of thinking about the world.
Thank you, Bronte. Well, I do think I need you all to put your hands together for Bronte. Thank you. On Time is a series from the Powerhouse. This conversation featured Bronte Gosper and was hosted by me, Rachael Hocking. Our program curator is Bobby Vergona, and this podcast was produced, edited and sound designed by Mara Schrepp-Fager. These conversations were recorded live by Ben Rumble and Ryan Carter at the Sydney Observatory on Gadigal land. Powerhouse Head of Program is Claire Holland, Head of Digital is Callum Cooper, and the commissioning editor is Lisa Havilah. Special thanks to the Centre for Time and the team at Sydney Observatory. To keep up to date with the latest episodes and new content from the Powerhouse, follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts.